Welcome back to this video. And today we are going to continue on our topic, cellular respiration, which is in your chapter 7, part 2. And first and foremost, let's talk about the outline of this video. And in this video, we're going to talk about what is fermentation and what are the types of fermentation. So remember last week, in the last video, we actually mentioned about the aerobic respiration and also the types of the cellular respiration. So today, there are another type of the cellular respiration, which is fermentation. And what is fermentation? So fermentation is actually a process of incomplete breakdown of glucose in conditions of either limited oxygen or without oxygen. So it's opposite as the aerobic respiration, which they need to break down the glucose in the presence of oxygen. And in fermentation, it can be in a condition, it need to be carried out in the conditions of limited oxygens or without oxygens, okay? And after glycolysis, remember last time glycolysis means that the breakdown of glucose and the product of glycolysis will be two molecules of pyruvate. So if there is oxygen in the environment and the pyruvate will undergo oxidation and produce a very high amount of energy. But in this case, in fermentation, the two pyruvate molecule, due to the limited oxygen in the environment, they will undergo fermentation and it's either an alcohol fermentation or a lactic acid fermentation. So these are the two types of the fermentation that we want to talk about in this video. And let's talk about, start with the alcohol fermentation. So as the name suggests, alcohol fermentation means that the glucose break down and they will form the product as ethanol, which is your alcohol, okay? And also, of course, a small amount of energy if you compare this amount of energy to the aerobic respiration, okay? So incomplete breakdown of glucose into ethanol, carbon dioxide, and also energy. Let's recall a little bit. Do you still remember for aerobic respiration, which we mentioned in the last video? What's the product for the aerobic respiration? It is water, carbon dioxide, and also a high amount of energy. So in this case, in the fermentation, alcohol fermentation, it will be alcohol, carbon dioxide, and a small amount of energy. So where does this alcohol fermentation occurs? It's going to happen. Okay, first we give an example, which is yeast. Okay, so ethanol is used in beer and wine. So yeast, they're going to undergo fermentation and produce ethanol and also carbon dioxide. Okay, and then the ethanol produced by the yeast is used in the beer and also wine. Basically in our alcohol consumption, and also the yeast is going to produce alcohol and also produce carbon dioxide. And this is what going to make the bread dough rise, okay? So when we want to make a bread or a cake, okay, but usually it's in a bread, we'll use yeast, okay? And this yeast, after undergoes fermentation, they're going to produce carbon dioxide. So this carbon dioxide, which is a type of gas, is going to make the bread dough rise. So some of you might have some question. So when yeast undergoes fermentation, it's going to produce alcohol as well. So why don't I feel or taste any alcohol inside a bread? This is because when the bread dough is being baked, okay, and it's being baked and at a very high temperature, and the alcohol is going to evaporate. The alcohol is going to evaporate. So this is going to mix the alcohol to evaporate. So there's no more alcohol. So of course you can't taste any alcohol inside bread. All right, so next example of alcohol fermentation is in plants, but not in all plants, okay? So the very good example is a paddy plants, okay? Because you know that paddy plants, they grows in the waterlogged areas with very less oxygen. So they carry out alcohol fermentation. And this alcohol, as you know, is a toxic substance for for most of the plants. But this paddy plants is not, the alcohol is not toxic to paddy plants. That's why they can carry out alcohol fermentation. So the paddy plants, they're going to produce an enzyme named as an alcohol dehydrogenase. Okay, so this enzyme is going to break down the alcohol or the ethanol molecules into non-toxic carbon dioxide. So this is why paddy field are able to undergo alcohol fermentation without letting the alcohol to cause toxic effects on the plant itself. This is because they can produce this alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. So done with the alcohol fermentation, now we're moving on to a lactic acid fermentation. So the lactic acid fermentation, as the name suggests, is the breakdown of glucose into lactic acid and energy. So this lactic acid fermentation also happens when there's limited oxygen or absence of oxygen. So the first example that undergoes a lactic acid fermentation is what we call a lactobacillus. Okay, a lactobacillus. Lactobacillus is a bacteria. So they undergoes what we call as a milk fermentation to produce yogurt. So you want to produce yogurt, we will use this kind of bacteria named as a lactobacillus, which is quite good for our digestion. And this lactobacillus, they're going to act on the lactose, which is a milk sugar, a type of a simple carbohydrate, and turns it into a lactic acid. So this, lactic acid is sour in taste. So this is why your yogurt tastes sour. Okay, this is because it undergoes a lactic acid fermentation, and the presence of the lactic acid give your yogurt a sour taste. And lastly, we're going to talk about another example of where the lactic acid fermentation occurs. This is very important because it happens in our human muscle cell. So during a vigorous training or very excessive, very strenuous training, and the rate of oxygen use exceeds the oxygen supply. So the oxygen that we need is more than the oxygen that is being inhaled. Okay, understood? And the muscle is now in an oxygen deficiency state, or we have another name for this. It's called as a oxygen debt. Debt is something that we owe, like you have a debt for the bank, and in this case, we have an oxygen debt. Okay, oxygen debt means we are lacking of oxygen, and we need to compensate later. Okay, so glucose cannot break down completely because of the limited oxygen. So what happens? We have a fermentation, specifically a lactic acid fermentation. So the lactic acid going to accumulate, and this acid going to cause your fatigue and also muscle cramp inside your muscle. Fatigue means your muscle feels very tired, and your muscle will cramps also. That's why when you're running a marathon, if there is too much of the, your body is undergoes oxygen debt, and there's too much of the lactic acid accumulates, and this is going to cause a muscle cramp when you are having a marathon. So after we take some rest and also stop running, and the excess oxygen intake is going to oxidize, because even though we stop exercise, but we still breathe in a lot, inhale a lot. So this excess oxygen intake is going to oxidize the lactic acid, and the oxidation of lactic acid going to produce carbon dioxide, water, and energy, which is your aerobic respiration product. So now we can say that the oxygen debt is repaid, just like how you pay your debt, but we need to inhale more oxygen to pay our oxygen debt. Okay, so the important terms here is oxygen debt. All right, there's a graph here. So you can see at the beginning of exercise, we are in an oxygen debt, the red color one, which is our muscle cell is lack of oxygen. So after that, then at the end of the exercise, we still breathe in a lot, and then the excessive oxygen intake is going to repay the oxygen debt. Okay, and then we recover. This is how the two phases, oxygen debt and also the compensation or repay of the oxygen debt, the graph, before at the beginning of the exercise, and also at the end, and also during the recovery state. So let's recap a little bit for this video. So at first, we talk about what is fermentation. It's where the breakdown of glucose in limited oxygen, or even in an absence of oxygen's environment. And what are the types of fermentation? So we actually mentioned about an alcohol fermentation, which you can find it on the yeast, and also another type, which is the lactic acid fermentation, which is very important because that's what our human muscle cells going to happens every day if we are having a vigorous exercise. Okay, and that's all. And thank you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.